taxes, it's 80%. Well, without going into the details, you can see the approach. It's very, very general and broad and sweeping. But I come up with this number, obviously driven by the personal income tax and the progressivity of the personal income tax idea. And as you saw, it mean that whereas the average Canadian in 2000 paid $12,200 in taxes, the average immigrant, by my calculation, paid only $4,700. Well, the characteristics of the welfare state, the absorption of benefits. We have universality of access to nearly all social programs and benefits. It's famous Singh decision. Mr. Niskanen would not get very far here. He would have to change the Constitution. He had to build a wall around the programs. So except for Canada Pension Plan, which are based on what you have contributed in the past, even old age security benefits are automatically available to every immigrant. Social spending is about 70% of all program spending. And to elaborate a little bit on something that Stephen talked about, I assume that most of the spending, the marginal cost equals average cost. If you take your welfare spending, sure, there is a cost of administering the welfare ministries. An extra person doesn't cost that much more, but on the other hand, relative to the total amount in transfer payments made by most of these social transfer programs, the marginal cost is pretty close to the average cost. Other non-social spending programs, I also assume, along with Steve, that eventually we get crowding on highways, on bridges, on airports, on everything else, and especially social overhead, and you will have to put in new facilities. Well, the estimates of the spending costs, of the costs. The average spending on Canadians is $11,508. Now, when I presented this, Mike Walker had done a study earlier on the incidence of government spending as to whether there is a difference in the amount of government services consumed by people with different levels of income. And he discovered that one of the big impact has been the fact that the poor people don't send their children to university as regularly and high percentage as do people with high incomes. And that's a significant part of social spending, and so I adjusted it for this. It doesn't make a hell of a lot of difference, but I had to satisfy Mike Walker. So let's see then what my calculation is. The fiscal transfer is equal to the tax paid by the Canadians minus the tax paid by the immigrants on average, minus the benefits received by Canadians minus the benefits received by the immigrants. And my calculations show that this is $6,294 per person for someone who had been in Canada in the year 2002 for 10 years. Now, put this into perspective. The 1990 cohort consisted of 16,000 people, times this annual number gives you $1.36 billion, that 1 year alone, for that one group of people who arrived in 1990. If they live for 45 years and they don't, after 10 years, they don't get above 80%, then the lifetime cost is $282,000 per person. The cost for the entire life of the cohort of people who arrived in 1990 is $61.2 billion. Now, for cohorts that arrived between 1990 and 2002, 2.9 million of them, The total cost is $18.3 billion in the year 2002. That's 16% of total federal program spending, twice what we spent that year on defense, and more than we spent on federal health. Now, the next topics are, well, you know, this is not really important. What counts is that we have all these unfilled jobs. Some people this morning already did the preliminary work for me. Quickly, here's my graph. You have the problem of excess demand. The demand curve is sloping downwards, supply is sloping upward, and at W0, we can't find all the people whom we would like to employ. Well, there are two ways of settling this. One of them is to shift out the supply curve. That means bring in immigrants to meet the excess demand. The wage stays at W0. Or we can raise the wage to W star, and we also get rid of the problem. Now, I could, if I had more time and you were my students, I could now walk you through on what are the adjustments, including the reductions in the demand for labor by the employers. If the wages were high enough, if we didn't have immigrants, there wouldn't be teenagers flipping hamburgers at McDonald's. We would have robots doing it. There wouldn't be cash registers where they had to collect money. We would put cards in. There are substitutes of capital for labor that are raising the average productivity in society, which are being prevented by us having all these immigrants. I'd love to elaborate more on this, but I don't have the time. Let me just say, the other thing is we need immigrants to fill the empty spaces in Canada, to share the costs of the heavy investments which we have to make in order to service our population. Well, it used to be true that we were sparsely settled. It is true that the immigrants lower the average cost of the infrastructure. When we built the railroad from Winnipeg to Vancouver, through the prairies, there were very few passengers and very little goods to be transported. We needed people to settle to reduce the average cost of transport between Winnipeg and Vancouver. True. The same thing is for the private sector. In the olden days, in the 19th century, a part of the 20th century, when we needed immigrants to have a domestic market large enough so that we could have facilities. Okay, I have to go fast because I want to get quickly to my suggestion. Nobody raised it this morning on how to solve all of this problem. Of course, today you see we have no more problems with or benefits from having lower average costs on these infrastructure programs. Free trade, lower transportation costs. You can sell anywhere in the world. We don't need a domestic market to get this. So we will hear later on this afternoon Bill Robson talk to us about how silly it is to try to solve our low fertility rates, the problem with low fertility rates, through immigrants. The simulations that they have made is just absolutely astounding. But I trust them completely because we would have to have, in order to keep our dependency ratio at 20%, at 165 million in the year 2015. And that year alone we would require 7 million immigrants. It is just a total illusion. It's unbelievable that these words don't get out. And I really praise Bill Robson for having taken on this job. It's a very difficult technical job to look at these forecasts and the dynamics of up and down population trees and all these kinds of things. It's a very difficult job. And it takes a computer and an actuary and an economist combined to do this. But they have done it, and I really praise them. Well, my policy recommendations is a principle. I think the suggestion we heard this morning was in continued reliance on the bureaucracy. I would shift the biggest burden of selecting immigrants onto the private sector, away from the bureaucrats driven by their political bosses. Select persons with proven economic prospects and limit the numbers consistent with economic conditions at the time. And I think I'm modifying my position there a little bit. If the numbers come out too big, then the government may have to step in and say there is maximum. My recommendation is to implement these basic principles. Give only temporary visas to persons with employment contracts. Do away with what we have now, that somebody in India gives somebody a stamp and says, yeah, you passed our point system, here, now you can come into Canada and get all these benefits and so on. Give only temporary visas if the person has an employment contract. They can stay here for 2 years on this temporary work visa. If they continue to work hard and stay employed, then maybe a renewal of the temporary work visa for another 2 years, and then maybe after that they can become permanent immigrants, permanent residents in the way we do now. I think we should stop family unification, period. We heard some sob today that, you know, maybe we ought to do that's fair and whatnot. We should do what the Australians do. You want to bring in your family? Fine. Put up the money. We already have a rule saying you have to sponsor your parents. We already have crossed that bridge. We have already said, no, you can't bring them in and then just dump them on our welfare system and our healthcare system. We said, you have to sponsor them. But our sponsorship program has no teeth. People come and then their parents, oh, I don't have the money to pay for them. They have to go to the hospital. They have to have this operation. They have to have go into the old care home. I don't have the money. Well, you can read stories about this. There are thousands and thousands of people like that who've been sponsored. But of course it's rational for the government not to go after the sponsors because the sponsors don't have any money. What are you going to do with them? Are you going to put them on welfare? So, you know, we should do what the Australians do. You want your parents badly enough? Put up a bond. And if they require public assistance, you can draw on that bond. If they don't use it, you can have your bond back with interest. I'm really tough, huh? But working with Martin, I can tell you, he puts a lot of sense into me. And he said there has to remain a government role. And I think that the government should specify that there is to be a minimum pay attached to the employment contract. He's convinced me that if we had no more immigrant visas, but only temporary work visas, ultimately to be turned into permanent residence visas, we would be flooded with dishwashers. We would have specialized firms here that issue employment contracts. I'm run out of time. Issue employment contracts that say we need dishwashers, and they would come in mass, and that would defeat the purpose. Therefore, I would suggest a deal, let people in only if they have an employment contract equal to the average of wages earned in the region in which they wish to settle.